I lost my job on a Tuesday. My wife laughed by Wednesday. By Thursday I was tracing hidden bank accounts, a secret LLC, and a man named Raymond Tate. I didn't explode. I didn't beg. I packed the evidence, called an attorney, drove 14 hours to Austin, and started over with nothing but a technical paper my wife once called the most boring thing I'd ever produced. That paper tripled my income. And when Maggie finally sat across from me 18 months later asking if there was any version of us left, I looked at everything I'd built without her and gave her the clearest answer I've ever spoken in my life. Viewers, before we continue, please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories. My name is Luis Mons. I'm 38 years old, and for 11 years I designed bridges in Cincinnati, Ohio, the kind that carry thousands of people across rivers every single morning without a single one of them wondering whether the math holds. I was good at that math. Patient with it. I believed in foundations the way some men believe in God, quietly, completely, and without needing proof until the moment everything falls. I met Maggie when we were both 24. She was sharp, ambitious, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood its power structure. I was drawn to that. I thought it meant she understood strength. I didn't yet know she was also cataloging weakness, filing it away, quietly, for later. We married at 27. Small vineyard outside Columbus, 60 guests, no extravagance. I thought that simplicity meant we wanted the same things. That was my first miscalculation. The layoff came on a Tuesday in March. No warning. 14 of us walked into a glass conference room under fluorescent lights, handed thin manila folders by people who couldn't hold eye contact. Meridian Build Group had lost 3 federal contracts in succession and needed to cut the entire mid-level engineering division by noon. I drove home in total silence, no music, no calls. I sat in the driveway for exactly 11 minutes, watching the clock on the dashboard, rehearsing the words. When I walked into the kitchen, Maggie was ending a video call. She saw my face and set her phone down. I told her everything, the folder, the severance, the timeline. I told her calmly, the way I'd always delivered hard news, because I believed she was my partner and partners absorb hard news together. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not disbelief. Not nerves. A short, sharp exhale, like I'd fumbled something obvious. Then she picked up her phone and walked out of the room. On the counter, her screen briefly lit up with a name I didn't catch. But I felt it. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of my life. I applied to 42 positions in the first month. Heard back from 6. Interviewed with 3. Got nothing. Every morning I sat at my home desk with job boards open on my laptop while Maggie moved through the background, dressed sharply, phone in hand, completely unbothered. The emotional contrast between us was deafening in the way only silence can be. She had her own income. A brand consultancy she'd built steadily over 5 years, with clients who respected her instincts. But she made it clear, never directly, always through atmosphere, that she considered my unemployment my problem to solve. She stopped asking how interviews went. She started staying late and working weekends, telling me it was a demanding new client. I believed her because I wanted to. That's what desperation does, it makes you protect the last thing still standing. I later learned she'd been quietly resentful for years before the layoff ever happened. She'd grown up watching her mother dissolve into her father's ambitions, sacrificing a promising career in architecture to support his ventures. When his business eventually failed, her mother had nothing, no clients, no portfolio, no professional identity. Just dependency and regret. Maggie had promised herself at 17 that she would never become that woman. I understood that promise. What I didn't understand was how it had slowly curdled inside her, not into independence, but into a private scorecard she kept on me, tracking every moment I failed to match the trajectory she decided I needed to maintain. One evening I found a printed email she'd left on the kitchen counter by accident. A thread with her college friend Priya. Midway through it, Maggie had written, "Honestly, I've been checking out for a while. I just needed a reason." I read it twice. Set it back exactly where I found it. Said nothing. That night I opened her laptop to check a shared calendar. A browser tab was already open, a real estate listing. A one-bedroom apartment. Lease application. In her name only. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I'd spent 11 years designing structures under pressure, and the first thing engineering teaches you is this: if you want to understand a failure, you don't start with the visible crack. You trace backward until you find where the stress first accumulated. So I started paying attention the way I paid attention to load-bearing calculations. Quietly. Methodically. Without telegraphing a single thing. The shared bank app sent a notification on a Thursday evening while I sat in my car after another failed interview. A withdrawal of $4,200. The memo line read, "Home decor and renovation." We hadn't touched a home project in 2 years. I stared at that notification for a long time, sitting in a parking garage under yellow fluorescent light that made everything look slightly diseased. Over the following weeks I noticed the pattern clearly. Her personal laptop password had been changed. She took calls exclusively in the car. Our joint savings had been drawn down in increments, small enough each time to avoid triggering alarm, but large enough collectively to matter. I pulled 3 years of statements and laid them across my desk like blueprints, and what I saw looked less like a marriage and more like a managed exit. 3 weeks later, an anonymous LinkedIn message arrived. No name, no photo. Just 2 things, a photograph of Maggie at a restaurant I'd never visited, seated across from a man I didn't recognize, and a single name, Raymond Tate. A property developer from Louisville who, the message explained, had met Maggie through a client pitch 18 months earlier. The final line read, "She's been planning this longer than you think." I sat with that information for 4 days. Didn't sleep well. Ate poorly. Ran 6 miles every morning and thought about foundations, what they're made of, what they hide, how long they can bear weight before the surface above them shows the damage. On the 5th day I picked up my phone and called a family law attorney named Carol Sims. My voice was completely calm. Carol Sims was exactly the kind of woman you want across the table from you when your life is being quietly dismantled. She had 20 years of family law behind her and the particular stillness of someone who had heard every version of every story and remained unshocked by all of them. When I laid out everything, the withdrawals, the apartment application, the LinkedIn message, the printed email, she listened without interrupting, then said, "Document everything going forward. Dates, amounts, behaviors. Bring me a spreadsheet." So that became my second job. While Maggie thought I was home circulating my resume, I was building a case file with the same precision I once applied to load distribution models. Every withdrawal logged. Every late return home time-stamped. The second phone I'd spotted in her coat pocket, noted, "Not touched." What Carol uncovered in discovery was worse than I'd calculated. Maggie had quietly opened a sole proprietor LLC 14 months prior, registered to an address I didn't recognize, a commercial mailbox in a UPS store on the east side of Cincinnati. She'd been routing select client payments through it, keeping them entirely off our joint tax filing. When Carol showed me the total, it sat just under $60,000. Earned during our marriage. Legally, half mine. I remember the exact quality of light in Carol's office when she slid that document across her desk, gray afternoon, one lamp on, the kind of stillness that makes numbers feel heavier than they should. I didn't react. I just looked at the figure and thought about the laugh in the kitchen. About the email to Priya. About all the small moments I'd reinterpreted as stress or distance when they were actually choreography. Then my phone buzzed. A name I hadn't seen in 2 years, Brent Follerin. Former Meridian colleague. He'd left the firm early and started a boutique infrastructure consultancy in Austin, Texas. He'd watched the Meridian collapse in the news and new talent had just been shaken loose. He wanted to know if I was available. I stepped into Carol's hallway and said yes. For the first time in months, I felt something shift in my chest, something unlocking. I chose a Sunday because it was the one day Maggie had no calendar to disappear into. I was already seated in the living room when she came downstairs, no television, no ambient noise, just the particular silence of a space that knows what's about to happen inside it. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs when she saw my face. I'd worked hard to make it unreadable. I slid the folder across the coffee table without speaking. Inside, the LLC registration documents, 3 years of withdrawal records, the apartment lease application bearing her name and signature, and one printed screenshot, the photograph of her and Raymond Tate at the restaurant, date stamped, location embedded in the metadata. She went very still in the way that people go still when they realize the story they've been telling themselves has just run out of road. Then she said something I wasn't prepared for. She straightened, looked directly at me, and said, "You were never going to be enough, Luis. I saw the ceiling on you years ago." The words landed hard. Not because they destroyed me, but because they unlocked a memory I'd buried for over a decade. Early in our marriage, during a holiday visit, Maggie's father had taken me aside after dinner. He was a man who measured everything, love, loyalty, worth, in terms of upward momentum. He'd said to me over bourbon, almost casually, "My daughter doesn't tolerate stagnation. I raised her that way. I hope you're the kind of man who keeps moving." I'd received it as a compliment. Standing in that living room, I finally understood it was a taxonomy, and that Maggie had been applying it to me for years, waiting for the moment I proved his concern correct. I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I said, quietly, "I know about Raymond. I know about the LLC. Carol Sims has everything. You'll hear from her Monday morning." Her expression moved through fury, then calculation, then something close to fear. I walked upstairs. My phone buzzed. "Brent, partner-level offer. Austin's ready." The divorce proceedings lasted 4 months. Maggie hired a litigator with a reputation for aggression, a downtown Cincinnati attorney who favored delay tactics and emotional escalation. Carol Sims had a reputation for being better, and she was. She was surgical in a way that made aggression look like amateur theater. The LLC funds were classified as marital assets. The apartment deposit, drawn from our joint account, was credited back to my settlement. A portion of her client revenue from the preceding 14 months was factored into the final division. The outcome wasn't perfect. Divorce never is, because you're not just dividing money, you're dividing the version of yourself that existed inside the marriage, and that math never comes out even. But it was fair. And in the wreckage of everything I'd believed about my life, fair felt like a form of winning I hadn't expected to find. Raymond Tate vanished the moment the legal proceedings became public. His property firm had institutional investors who valued clean optics, and a contested divorce involving hidden assets and financial misconduct was not clean. He sent Maggie a message, "I only know this because she told me herself," much later, in a conversation I didn't anticipate, that said simply, "I can't be involved in this." She had dismantled 11 years for a man who disappeared the moment the cost became personal. Some consequences don't need my help to arrive. I left Cincinnati on a Wednesday morning in September. 2 bags, a box of books, a framed photograph I almost left on the counter but took at the last second, not from sentimentality, but because I'd decided I got to choose what I carried now. 14 hours to Austin. I stopped once, at a roadside diner in Texarkana, drank black coffee, and stared at the map on my phone. Behind me, a city that had watched me break. Ahead, nothing familiar. Nothing familiar felt like the first honest breath I'd taken in years. My phone buzzed as I pulled off the highway into Austin. A voicemail. A woman's voice I didn't recognize. "Mr. Mons, my name is Claudia Park. We've been watching your work. We'd love to meet. Austin was a different world in every way that mattered. Folarin and Associates operated out of a converted warehouse space in East Austin, exposed concrete, glass walls covered in blueprints, the particular energy of a small firm that knows it's good and is quietly proving it to everyone else. Brent met me at the door on my first morning, handed me a coffee, and said, "I need you running point on the Brazos River Rehabilitation Project by end of week. No orientation. No adjustment period. Just work," which was exactly what I needed. Within 6 weeks I was leading the largest of 3 state bridge contracts the firm had landed. Within 4 months I'd leveraged an old Meridian connection to bring in a federal grant contact that effectively doubled the firm's projected annual revenue. Brent formalized a junior partnership offer by month 5. I signed it at my kitchen table at 11 at night and sat quietly for a long time afterward, thinking about the conference room in Cincinnati, the manila folder, the fluorescent lights. Claudia Park's call turned out to be entirely legitimate. She was a director at Alderon Infrastructure Group, a national firm that had begun acquiring boutique consultancies with strong regional contracts. They weren't moving on Folarin, not yet, but they were watching the space carefully, and they were watching me specifically because of a technical paper I'd written 4 years earlier on load distribution modeling in aging municipal bridges. A paper I'd presented at a regional conference to an audience of 30 people. A paper Maggie had once glanced at and called the most boring thing you've ever produced. That paper became the centerpiece of my presentation to Alderon's board of directors in a 42nd floor Dallas conference room. 12 executives. Floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked them through a methodology I developed in quiet obscurity in Ohio, and when I finished, the room was silent in the specific way that means you've said something that lands. They offered a consulting retainer that tripled my former Meridian salary. I drove back to Austin that night with the windows down, thinking about ceilings. I came home one evening to a voicemail from a Cincinnati number I almost didn't recognize. 7 months had passed since the divorce was finalized. I'd stopped flinching at Ohio area codes, mostly. I poured a glass of water, stood at my kitchen window looking out at the Austin skyline going amber in the early evening, and pressed play. Her voice was different. The certainty was gone, that particular Maggie quality of always sounding like she'd already accounted for every variable. What was left sounded smaller. Careful. She said she'd heard I was doing well. She didn't say how she'd heard. She said she'd been going through a difficult stretch and left it there without definition, which told me more than elaboration would have. Then she said she'd been thinking about the years we'd shared. And then, after a pause that felt deliberate, "I think I made a mistake, Luis." I played it twice. Set the phone face down on the counter and stood there with the silence. What I learned through mutual friends over the following weeks filled in the outline. After Raymond vanished, Maggie had moved to rebuild her consultancy independently. But 2 of her largest clients, both of whom traveled in professional circles where reputation functions as currency, had learned about the LLC irregularities that surfaced during the divorce proceedings. They'd ended their contracts quietly, without confrontation, which is always worse than confrontation because it leaves nothing to argue against. Her professional standing, constructed carefully over a decade, had developed a fracture she couldn't publicly address. She wasn't destitute. Maggie was too capable for collapse. But she was, for the first time, genuinely uncertain, and uncertainty was the one emotional state she had never developed tolerance for. I understood that about her with a clarity I couldn't have accessed inside the marriage. She had called me because I was the only person she'd known who had learned to live inside uncertainty and come out the other side still standing. I picked up my phone. I started typing. My fingers paused above the screen. I was back in Cincinnati for an Alderon site visit when I replied, a brief message, nothing generous, nothing cold. Just, "If you want to talk, I have an hour Thursday morning." She responded within 4 minutes. I arrived at the coffee shop first. Corner table, natural light coming through the front windows, the particular mid-morning quiet of a place between its breakfast and lunch rushes. I ordered 2 coffees out of 11 years of habit, then sat with the second cup in front of an empty chair, thinking about what that said about me. I didn't send it back. She looked different when she walked in. Not diminished, Maggie would never allow diminishment to show on her face, but older in the specific way that only consequence ages a person. Not time. Consequence. She sat down across from me, and for the first time in all the years I'd known her, she didn't seem to know how to begin a conversation. So I waited. I gave her that. She apologized. Her hands were flat on the table, her eyes steady. She'd prepared this, I could tell, and I gave her full credit for that discipline. She talked about her mother, about the fear she'd carried since watching that marriage collapse, about how she'd built a private survival logic that had eventually stopped being about protection and started being about preemptive punishment. She said she'd told herself leaving was self-preservation when it had actually been something she was less proud of. I listened all the way through without interrupting. When she finished I said, "I believe you mean that, Maggie. And I want you to know, I forgave you a long time ago. Not for your sake. For mine. Because I needed to stop carrying it." She blinked. She'd arrived prepared for anger and didn't have a ready response to peace. Then, slowly, she said, "Is there any version of this where we could find our way back?" I picked up my coffee cup. Held it. The ambient noise of the shop seemed to fall away. I set the cup down and said, "No." Not with anger. Not with the satisfaction I might have imagined feeling in the months when the wound was still fresh. Just, no. Quiet and clean, the way you mark a final load calculation on a blueprint before signing your name to it. No ambiguity. No structural weakness. I told her that forgiveness and return were 2 different architectural systems, that you could clear the damage from a foundation without ever rebuilding on the same ground. I told her that what I'd built in Austin was the first thing in years that belonged entirely to me, that hadn't been shaped around someone else's fear of my limitations or someone else's definition of my ceiling. I told her that she hadn't been entirely wrong, I had been stagnating. But it hadn't been a character flaw. It had been the slow symptom of a marriage where I had gradually, invisibly, stopped believing in my own trajectory. Losing the marriage, losing the job, losing the version of myself I'd been maintaining for her benefit, that had been the structural failure that forced me back to my own foundation. Back to the paper nobody read. Back to the math that was mine. I thanked her for that. I said it without irony and I meant every word. She nodded once, slowly. Her eyes were wet but she didn't let it become anything more. She was too proud for public grief, and I respected that genuinely, the way you respect a quality in someone even when the relationship to them is over. She gathered her coat, stood, and said, "I hope Austin keeps being good to you, Luis." I watched her walk out through the front door into the Cincinnati morning. I sat alone for a while with 2 half-empty cups and the particular stillness of a man who has stopped building for other people and finally, irrevocably, started building for himself. 18 months after the worst Tuesday of my life, the tally was simple. A partnership. A retainer that tripled what I'd lost. A name appearing in professional circles that hadn't known it 6 months ago. And a quiet apartment in Austin that felt more like home than any house I'd ever shared. The laugh in the kitchen still visits me sometimes. Late nights. Still moments. It doesn't sting anymore. Now it sounds like a starting gun. That evening, back in Austin, I opened my laptop to find a new email in my inbox. The sender's name stopped me cold, someone connected to my earliest work in Cincinnati, someone I hadn't thought about in years. Someone whose reappearance meant the past wasn't quite as finished with me as I'd believed. I leaned forward. And I began to read. Thanks for watching, please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories.